The sun was setting over the bustling streets of Boston as I made my way home from work. The crisp autumn air nipped at my cheeks, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. It was just another Thursday, or so I thought. Little did I know that this ordinary evening would become a turning point in my life, forever changing the dynamics of my family and my place within it. I climbed the steps to our brownstone, fumbling with my keys as I balanced a bag of groceries in my other arm. Mom had asked me to pick up a few things for dinner, as she always did. It was our monthly family gathering, a tradition we'd kept up since I was a kid. Usually, these dinners were a mix of catching up, gentle ribbing, and the occasional squabble over who got the last slice of pie. But tonight, there was an undercurrent of tension that I couldn't quite place. As I pushed open the front door, the warmth of the house enveloped me, along with the familiar scent of Mom's lasagna baking in the oven. I could hear muffled voices coming from the living room, but they didn't have the usual cadence of our family's banter. Something was off. "I'm home," I called out, kicking off my shoes and hanging up my jacket. The voices in the living room hushed immediately. Odd, I thought, as I made my way to the kitchen to drop off the groceries. "Sarah? Is that you?" Mom's voice floated from the living room, strained and unfamiliar. "Yeah, Mom." Just putting away the groceries, I replied, trying to keep my tone light despite the growing knot in my stomach. "Come in here when you're done, will you? We need to talk." Those words. "We need to talk." They never preceded anything good, did they? I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever was waiting for me in the next room. As I walked down the hallway, family photos lining the walls seemed to watch me, their frozen smiles a stark contrast to the atmosphere I was about to enter. I stepped into the living room, and the scene before me made me stop in my tracks. Mom and Dad were seated on the couch, their postures rigid and faces set in grim lines. My older sister, Emily, was perched on the armchair, looking uncomfortable and slightly guilty. The air was thick with unspoken words and barely contained emotions. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice sounding small even to my own ears. Mom's eyes met mine, and I saw a flash of something I'd never seen before: disappointment, maybe even disgust. "Sit down, Sarah," she said, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. I lowered myself into the seat, feeling like I was facing a firing squad rather than my own family. The silence stretched on, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, a wedding gift to my parents from years ago. Finally, Dad cleared his throat. "Sarah, we've been talking, and, well, there's no easy way to say this. We're concerned about your contributions to this family." I blinked, confused. "My contributions? What do you mean?" Mom leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Look at your sister," she said, her voice rising unexpectedly. "Emily's been sending $20,000 every month to help with the family expenses. And you? What have you been doing?" The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the blood drain from my face as I struggled to process what I was hearing. I've been sending what I can," I stammered, my mind racing. I thought it was enough." "Enough?" Dad scoffed. "Sarah, you're 28 years old. You should be doing more. Emily's been carrying this family on her back, and you've been coasting along, barely contributing." I looked at Emily, hoping to find some support, but she averted her gaze, suddenly very interested in the pattern of the rug beneath her feet. "But I've been working hard," I protested weakly. "I just got a promotion at the firm, and I've been putting in extra hours." You thought wrong," Mom cut me off. Her next words came out as a shout that made me flinch. "Look at your sister sending $20,000 every month. You are a useless daughter." The room fell silent, the echo of her words hanging in the air like a physical presence. I felt as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. My chest tightened, and I struggled to breathe. Years of feeling overshadowed by Emily, of trying to measure up, of thinking I was finally doing okay, it all came crashing down around me in that moment. "It's me," I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. "I'm the one who's been sending the money." For a split second, confusion flickered across my parents' faces. But before anyone could respond, Dad's voice boomed through the room. "Shut up. Stop trying to steal your sister's success. Why don't you stop the payments then? His words trailed off as the implication of what I'd said sank in. Emily's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and what looked like relief. What do you mean, it's you? Mom asked, her voice quieter now, but no less intense. I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts. The money, the $20,000 a month. It's been coming from me, not Emily. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears as I watched the expressions on my family members' faces cycle through disbelief, confusion, and slowly dawning realization. But how? Dad finally asked, his earlier anger replaced by bewilderment. I closed my eyes for a moment, gathering my strength. When I opened them, I looked directly at my parents. Remember that startup I've been working on in my free time? The one you both said was a waste of effort. I saw a flicker of recognition in their eyes. Well, it took off. Big time. I sold it 6 months ago for a substantial amount. I've been sending money home ever since, trying to help out without making a big deal of it. Emily's voice, small and hesitant, broke through the tension. I knew about it. Sarah asked me to keep it quiet. She didn't want to brag or make anyone feel indebted. Mom's face had gone pale, and Dad looked like he'd been struck. The realization of what they'd just said, the accusations they'd hurled, was clearly sinking in. But why didn't you tell us? Mom asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I felt a lump forming in my throat, years of pent-up emotions threatening to spill over. Because I wanted you to be proud of me for once. Not because of money, but because of who I am. I thought if I could help without making a fuss, maybe you'd see that I'm not useless. That I'm trying. The room fell silent once again, but this time it was a silence heavy with regret and unspoken apologies. I could see the dawning horror on my parents' faces as they realized the magnitude of their misjudgment. Dad opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a hand. I wasn't ready to hear whatever he was about to say. The wound was too fresh, the hurt too raw. I think I need some air, I said, standing up abruptly. No one moved to stop me as I walked out of the living room, down the hallway, and out the front door. As I stepped onto the porch, the cool night air hit my face, and I took a deep, shuddering breath. The street was quiet, most of our neighbors already settled in for the evening. A few houses down, I could see the warm glow of windows and hear the faint sound of laughter. Normal families having normal dinners, I thought bitterly. I sank down onto the porch steps, my mind reeling from everything that had just happened. The accusations, the reveal, the looks on their faces, it all swirled together in a dizzying mix of emotions. Anger, hurt, relief, and a strange sense of liberation all vied for dominance in my heart. As I sat there, staring out at the familiar street I'd grown up on, I realized that something fundamental had shifted. The carefully constructed image of our family, the roles we'd all played for so long, had been shattered. And in its wake, I was left with a decision to make, one that would shape not just my relationship with my family, but the course of my entire life. The porch light flickered on behind me, casting my shadow long across the lawn. I heard the creak of the screen door opening, followed by hesitant footsteps. But I wasn't ready to face them yet. I wasn't ready for the apologies or explanations or whatever else they might offer. Instead, I stood up, brushed off my jeans, and started walking down the street. I needed time to think, to process, to decide what came next. As I walked away from the house, I could feel their eyes on my back, but I didn't turn around. The night stretched out before me, full of uncertainty, but also possibility. For the first time in my life, I felt truly seen by my family, not as the perpetual disappointment, not as the little sister forever in Emily's shadow, but as myself. It was a bittersweet revelation, coming as it did on the heels of such painful accusations. As I rounded the corner, leaving my childhood home behind, I realized that this was more than just a family squabble. This was a crossroads. And whatever I decided to do next would define not just my relationship with my family, but my relationship with myself. The cool autumn breeze ruffled my hair, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked and a car horn honked. The ordinary sounds of the neighborhood I'd grown up in suddenly seemed alien and unfamiliar. Or maybe it was me who had changed in the space of one tumultuous evening. I walked on into the night, each step taking me further from the house, but closer to a decision that would alter the course of my life forever. The weight of expectations, of unspoken resentments and misunderstandings seemed to lift with each block I put between myself and that disastrous family meeting. And in its place, a new feeling began to take root, a tentative, fragile sense of possibility. What would happen next? I didn't know. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had the power to decide for myself. And that, I realized as I walked on under the star-filled sky, was a start. I don't know how long I walked that night. The streets of Boston, once so familiar, seemed to stretch endlessly before me. Each step took me further from the house I'd grown up in, but the echoes of that disastrous family meeting still rang in my ears. Mom's accusation, Dad's angry dismissal, Emily's guilty silence, they all swirled together in a cacophony of hurt and betrayal. As I wandered through the quiet neighborhoods, past brownstones with warm, glowing windows and the occasional late-night coffee shop, I found myself at a crossroads, both literally and figuratively. I stood at the intersection of Commonwealth Avenue and Massachusetts Avenue, the sprawling expanse of the Charles River visible in the distance. It was here, under the soft glow of a street lamp, that the full weight of what had transpired truly hit me. For years, I'd been living in Emily's shadow. My older sister, the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. And me? I was Sarah, the perpetual disappointment. The one who was never quite good enough, never quite living up to the family's expectations. But tonight, everything had changed. The truth was out. I was the one supporting the family, not Emily. And how had they reacted? With disbelief, anger, and accusations. I found a bench overlooking the river and sank down onto it, my legs suddenly feeling too weak to support me. The cool metal was a shock against my skin, grounding me in the present moment. I watched the moonlight shimmer on the water's surface, the gentle lapping of waves against the shore providing a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil in my mind. As I sat there, memories began to flood back. All the times I'd been compared to Emily, in school, in sports, in our careers. The proud smiles on my parents' faces when she got into Harvard contrasted with their lukewarm congratulations when I was accepted to Boston University. The way they dismissed my startup idea, telling me to focus on my real job instead. And all the while, I'd been working tirelessly, not just at my day job, but on my passion project, determined to prove myself. When the startup took off, it had felt like vindication. Finally, I had achieved something significant, something that was all mine. But even then, I couldn't bring myself to tell them outright. Instead, I'd chosen to help quietly, sending money home each month without fanfare. Part of me had hoped they'd figure it out, that they'd realize I was capable of great things too. But they hadn't. They'd assumed it was Emily, because of course it was Emily. It was always Emily. The anger that had been simmering inside me began to boil over. I was angry at my parents for their assumptions, at Emily for her silence, but most of all, I was angry at myself. Angry for letting this go on for so long, for not standing up for myself, for constantly seeking approval that never seemed to come. As I sat there, stewing in my anger and hurt, a jogger passed by, her rhythmic footfalls echoing in the quiet night. She nodded at me as she passed, just a brief acknowledgement between strangers. But in that moment, something shifted inside me. Here was someone who saw me not as a daughter or a sister, not as a success or a failure, but simply as another person existing in the world. And suddenly I realized that's all I needed to be. I didn't need to be the perfect daughter. I didn't need to measure up to Emily's accomplishments. I didn't need to silently support my family while they continued to underestimate and undervalue me. I just needed to be Sarah, with all my flaws, all my strengths, all my dreams and ambitions. The realization hit me like a thunderbolt, electrifying every nerve in my body. I stood up abruptly, my sudden movement startling a nearby pigeon into flight. Its wings flapped loudly in the quiet night, a sound that felt like an exclamation point to my epiphany. In that moment, I made a decision that would alter the course of my life forever. I pulled out my phone, my fingers shaking slightly as I navigated to my banking app. With a deep breath, I canceled the recurring transfer to my parents' account. The $20,000 that had been scheduled to go out next week would stay in my account. For the first time in months, I was choosing myself over my family's expectations. As I hit the confirm button, I felt a mix of emotions wash over me. There was fear, certainly, fear of the fallout, fear of disappointing my family even further. But there was also an overwhelming sense of relief, of liberation. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time ever, I felt truly in control of my own life. I looked out over the Charles River again, watching the city lights reflect off its surface. Boston had been my home for my entire life, but suddenly it felt different. Bigger somehow. Full of possibilities I'd never allowed myself to consider before. As I stood there, a cool breeze ruffled my hair, carrying with it the faint scent of fall, crisp leaves, and wood smoke. It felt like change, like the turning of a page. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the night air, and made my way back towards the street. I hailed a cab, giving the driver an address I'd looked up earlier, a hotel in Back Bay. I couldn't face going home tonight, couldn't bear the thought of the tense silence or the awkward attempts at apology that would surely be waiting for me. Tonight, I needed space to think, to plan, to figure out what came next. As the cab wound its way through the familiar streets, I watched the city pass by outside the window. The brownstones of Beacon Hill gave way to the shops of Newbury Street, then the towering buildings of the financial district. Each neighborhood held memories, family dinners, school events, nights out with friends. But tonight, they all seemed to belong to a different Sarah, a Sarah who no longer existed. The cab pulled up in front of the hotel, a sleek, modern building that stood in stark contrast to the traditional architecture around it. As I paid the driver and stepped out onto the sidewalk, I felt a sense of anticipation building inside me. This wasn't just a night away from home, it was the first step towards a new life. I checked in, barely registering the polite small talk of the receptionist. My mind was already racing ahead, considering possibilities, making plans. By the time I reached my room on the 15th floor, I felt more awake and alive than I had in years. The room was simple but elegant, with a large window offering a panoramic view of the city. I stood there for a long moment, looking out at the twinkling lights of Boston spread out before me. Somewhere out there was my family home, where my parents and Emily were probably still reeling from the evening's revelations. Part of me felt guilty for leaving, for not staying to hash things out. But a larger part knew that this distance was necessary, for them and for me. I sat down on the edge of the bed, pulling out my phone again. There were missed calls and messages from my family, but I wasn't ready to deal with those yet. Instead, I opened my email and began to compose a message to my boss. I explained that I needed to take some personal time off, effective immediately. I didn't go into details, but I assured him that I would tie up any loose ends remotely. As I hit send, I felt another wave of that liberating feeling wash over me. For so long, I'd been living my life according to others' expectations, my family's, society's, even my own misguided notions of what I should be doing. But not anymore. From this moment on, I was going to live life on my own terms. I kicked off my shoes and lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling. The events of the evening played through my mind like a movie. The family dinner, the accusations, the revelation, my solitary walk through the city. It all felt surreal, like something that had happened to someone else. But it had happened. And now, I had to figure out what came next. I thought about my job, a good position at a respected firm, but not something I was passionate about. I thought about my apartment, comfortable, but filled with reminders of a life I was rapidly outgrowing. I thought about my friends, my hobbies, my daily routines. How much of it truly made me happy? How much of it was just what I thought I was supposed to do? As the night wore on, I began to make lists. Things I wanted to do, places I wanted to see, goals I wanted to achieve. Some were small. Try that new restaurant on Hanover Street. Take a pottery class. Others were bigger. Travel to Japan. Write a book. Start another company. But they were all mine, all things I was choosing for myself. Around 3 a.m., Exhausted but exhilarated, I finally fell into a deep sleep. When I woke the next morning, sunlight streaming through the window, I felt different. Lighter, somehow, as if I'd shed a skin I'd outgrown. I ordered room service for breakfast, a luxury I rarely allowed myself, and sat by the window, watching the city come to life below. As I sipped my coffee, I steeled myself for what I knew I had to do next. It was time to face my family. I picked up my phone, took a deep breath, and dialed my parents' number. It rang once, twice, 3 times before my mother's voice, hesitant and tired, answered. "Sarah? Where are you? We've been so worried." I closed my eyes, gathering my courage. When I spoke, my voice was calm and steady. "Mom, we need to talk. All of us. But this time, things are going to be different." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a soft, "Okay." As I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The conversation ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, I was ready for it. Ready to stand up for myself, to demand the respect and recognition I deserved. Ready to redefine my relationships on my own terms. I gathered my things, checked out of the hotel, and stepped out into the bright Boston morning. The air was crisp, carrying the promise of autumn and new beginnings. As I hailed a cab to take me home, I felt a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. I was done living in anyone's shadow. It was time for Sarah to step into the light. The cab ride back to my family's home in Brookline felt both too short and interminably long. As we wound through the familiar streets, past the lush greenery of the Emerald Necklace and the stately homes of my childhood neighborhood, I rehearsed what I wanted to say in my head. But no matter how I phrased it, the words felt inadequate to express the tumult of emotions I was experiencing. When the cab pulled up in front of our brownstone, I took a deep breath before stepping out. The house looked exactly the same as it had yesterday, but everything felt different. I was different. As I climbed the steps to the front door, I steeled myself for what was to come. Before I could even reach for my keys, the door swung open. Mom stood there, her eyes red-rimmed from what I assumed was a sleepless night. "Sarah," she breathed, relief evident in her voice. She reached out as if to hug me, then seemed to think better of it, her arms falling awkwardly to her sides. "Hi, Mom," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Can I come in?" She stepped aside wordlessly, allowing me to enter the house that had been my home for so many years. The familiar scent of lemon furniture polish and Dad's favorite coffee engulfed me as I stepped inside. In the living room, I could see Dad and Emily sitting tensely on the couch, both looking up as I entered. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room as I took a seat in the armchair opposite them. It was the same chair I'd sat in last night when everything had fallen apart. Now, it felt like a throne from which I would deliver my Declaration of Independence. Dad cleared his throat. "Sarah, we owe you an apology." His voice was gruff, emotion making it rougher than usual. "What we said last night was inexcusable. We had no idea." I held up a hand, cutting him off. "You're right, you didn't. And that's part of the problem." I took a deep breath, centering myself. "For years, I've been trying to live up to your expectations, to be the daughter you wanted me to be. But in doing so, I lost sight of who I am and what I want for myself." Emily shifted uncomfortably on the couch. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I should have told them the truth about the money. I didn't want to betray your trust." I looked at my sister, seeing her in a new light. For so long, I'd seen her as the perfect one, the one I could never measure up to. But now, I saw the weight of expectations on her shoulders too, the strain of trying to be what our parents wanted. "It's okay, I said softly. "This isn't about the money. Not really. It's about the fact that for my entire life, I felt like I was living in your shadow. Like nothing I did was ever good enough." Mom made a strangled sound, half sob, half protest. "Sarah, that's not true. We've always been proud of you." I turned to face her, feeling a surge of courage. "Have you? Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like you've spent years comparing me to Emily, always finding me wanting. Do you have any idea how that feels?" The room fell silent again, the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air. I could see the shock and hurt on their faces, but also the dawning realization. For perhaps the first time, they were seeing me, really seeing me, as my own person, not just in relation to Emily. "I've made a decision," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "I'm stopping the monthly payments. Not because I don't want to help, but because I need to focus on myself for a while. I need to figure out who I am outside of this family dynamic." Dad leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Sarah, you don't have to do this. We understand now. We'll do better, I promise." I shook my head. "It's not about you doing better, Dad. It's about me doing what's best for me. For once in my life, I'm choosing myself." The conversation that followed was long and difficult. There were tears, from all of us, and moments of anger and frustration. But there were also moments of understanding, glimpses of a new kind of relationship that might be possible if we were all willing to put in the work. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the living room, we finally reached a kind of truce. My parents agreed to respect my decision about the money, and I agreed to keep lines of communication open as we all navigated this new terrain. I left the house that evening feeling drained but oddly liberated. As I walked down the street towards the T station, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Emily. "I'm proud of you, little sis. Let's grab coffee soon, just the two of us." A small smile tugged at my lips as I typed back a quick, "Sounds good." Maybe, just maybe, something good could come out of all this chaos. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of change. I threw myself into my work, channeling my newfound energy and independence into projects I'd been putting off. I started exploring Boston in a way I never had before, discovering hidden gems in neighborhoods I'd never bothered to visit. I even signed up for that pottery class I'd been thinking about, finding unexpected joy in the feel of clay beneath my fingers. But the real test came a month after that fateful family dinner. It was a crisp October afternoon when my phone rang, my mother's name flashing on the screen. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Sarah." Her voice sounded strained, almost desperate. We just got the bank statement. The money, it didn't come through this month." I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. This was the moment I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. "I know, Mom. Remember, I told you I was stopping the payments." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her voice was a mixture of disbelief and accusation. But, we thought you'd change your mind. We need that money, Sarah. Your father and we've gotten used to a certain lifestyle. And what about Emily's kids' college funds?" I felt a familiar pang of guilt, quickly followed by a surge of resolve. "Mom, I'm sorry, but I meant what I said. I can't keep supporting everyone at the expense of my own life and dreams. But we're your family." The desperation in her voice was clear now. "How can you do this to us?" I gripped the phone tighter, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I'm not doing anything to you, Mom. I'm doing something for myself. For the first time in my life, I'm putting myself first." The conversation devolved from there. Mom's pleas turned to accusations, her voice rising with each passing minute. I could hear Dad in the background, his deep voice rumbling with what sounded like anger. At one point, Emily got on the phone, her voice tearful as she talked about how this would affect her kids. Through it all, I remained silent. I let their words wash over me, feeling the sting of each accusation, the weight of their disappointment. But beneath it all, I felt something else growing stronger, a sense of rightness, of finally standing up for myself. When the torrent of words finally subsided, I spoke softly but firmly. "I love you all, but I need to do this for me. I hope you can understand that someday." Without waiting for a response, I ended the call. My hand shook slightly as I set the phone down on the coffee table. I half expected it to ring again immediately, for the onslaught to continue. But it remained silent. In the quiet of my apartment, I let out a long, shaky breath. The reality of what I'd done, of the bridge I'd potentially burned, hit me full force. For a moment, doubt crept in. Had I made a terrible mistake? But then I looked around my apartment, at the half-finished pottery projects scattered on the dining table, the travel brochures for Japan spread out on the couch, the whiteboard covered in ideas for my next business venture. This was my life, my dreams, my future. And for the first time, I was truly living it for myself. The next few days were a blur of emotions. I oscillated between feeling liberated and terrified, empowered and guilty. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from family members, some angry, some pleading, some trying to guilt me into changing my mind. I read them all, but I didn't respond. I needed time to process, to stand firm in my decision without being swayed by their emotions. A week after the phone call, I met Emily for coffee at our favorite cafe in the North End. The autumn air was crisp as we sat at an outdoor table, the smell of freshly baked cannoli wafting from the bakery next door. Emily looked tired, dark circles under her eyes betraying sleepless nights. "They're not handling it well," she said without preamble, stirring her latte absently. I nodded, wrapping my hands around my own mug. "I didn't expect them to." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I get why you did it, Sarah. I really do. But it's hard. They're talking about having to downsize, maybe even sell the house." I felt a pang of guilt, quickly followed by a flash of anger. They wouldn't have to if they'd been more responsible with their finances. It's not fair for them to rely on us to fund their lifestyle. Emily nodded slowly. "I know. It's a big change. For all of us." We sat in silence for a while, sipping our coffees and watching the world go by. Finally, Emily spoke again, her voice soft. "I'm proud of you, for standing up for yourself. I wish I had your courage." I reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "It's not too late, Em. You can make changes too, if you want to." She gave me a small smile, squeezing back. "Maybe. We'll see." As we parted ways that afternoon, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this upheaval could lead to positive changes for all of us. The weeks turned into months, and slowly, a new normal began to emerge. My parents, forced to confront their financial reality, started making changes. They put the house on the market, looking for something smaller and more manageable. Dad, who had been talking about retirement for years, decided to take on some consulting work to supplement their income. Emily, inspired by my stand, started setting boundaries of her own. She reduced her own financial support to our parents, redirecting that money into a savings account for her kids and a long-overdue vacation with her husband. As for me, I threw myself into building the life I'd always dreamed of but never dared to pursue. I started my own consulting firm, drawing on the experience from my previous startup. I took that trip to Japan, immersing myself in a culture I'd long been fascinated by. And I continued with my pottery classes, finding unexpected joy and peace in the simple act of creating. It wasn't all smooth sailing, of course. There were still tense family dinners, awkward holidays, and the occasional heated argument. But slowly, gradually, things began to shift. Our relationships, once defined by expectations and comparisons, started to evolve into something more authentic, more equal. One crisp Sunday afternoon in late November, I found myself back in my childhood neighborhood. The trees lining the streets were bare now, their branches stark against the gray sky. I stood outside the brownstone that had been my home for so many years, a sold sign now hanging prominently in the front yard. As I stood there, lost in thought, the front door opened. Mom stepped out, wrapped in a warm coat, a box in her arms. She paused when she saw me, surprise flickering across her face. "Sarah," she said softly. "I didn't know you were coming by today." I shrugged, suddenly feeling awkward. "I didn't really plan to. I just found myself here." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "We're almost done packing. Would you like to come in? Have a cup of tea?" I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. As I followed her into the house, I realized something had changed. The air between us felt different, lighter somehow, free from the weight of unmet expectations and unspoken resentments. As we sat in the kitchen, surrounded by boxes and memories, Mom reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything. We didn't see you, not really. But we're trying to now." I felt tears prick at my eyes as I squeezed her hand. "I know, Mom. I'm sorry too. For not speaking up sooner, for letting things get to this point. We sat there in companionable silence, sipping our tea and watching the shadows lengthen outside the window. And in that moment, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The road ahead might still be uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about where it might lead. As I left the house that evening, I paused on the front steps, looking back at the place that had shaped so much of my life. It wasn't just my parents who were moving on to a new chapter. We all were. And while the journey hadn't been easy, I knew in my heart that it had been necessary. I took a deep breath of the cool evening air, feeling a sense of lightness and possibility. Whatever came next, I was ready to face it, not as the shadow of my sister, not as the family disappointment, but as Sarah. Just Sarah. And that, I realized with a smile, was more than enough. As the crisp autumn days gave way to the chill of winter, I found myself grappling with an internal struggle that seemed as relentless as the New England weather. The initial surge of empowerment I'd felt after standing up to my family had faded, replaced by a complex tangle of emotions that I couldn't quite unravel. On the surface, things were going well. My consulting firm was taking off, with a steady stream of clients keeping me busy. I'd finally unpacked the last of the souvenirs from my Japan trip, each item a tangible reminder of the freedom I'd claimed for myself. My apartment, once a place I merely slept, was slowly transforming into a true reflection of who I was becoming. But in the quiet moments, when the hustle of the day died down and I was left alone with my thoughts, doubt would creep in like a cold draft under a door. One particularly frigid evening in January, I found myself sitting by the window of my Beacon Hill apartment, watching snowflakes swirl in the glow of the streetlights. The city was muffled under a blanket of white, the usual urban cacophony softened to a whisper. In the stillness, memories of that fateful family dinner played on repeat in my mind. I could still hear the echo of my mother's words, "You're a useless daughter." The pain of that accusation, though months old now, still had the power to make me flinch. I closed my eyes, trying to push the memory away, but it clung stubbornly like frost on a window pane. Had I done the right thing? The question nagged at me, persistent and unyielding. I'd stood up for myself, yes, but at what cost? The image of my parents' faces, shocked, hurt, angry, when I told them I was stopping the payments was seared into my memory. And Emily, the look of betrayal in her eyes when she realized the position I'd put her in still made my stomach churn with guilt. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through the messages I'd received over the past few months. There were fewer now, the initial flood of pleas and accusations having slowed to a trickle. But each one still had the power to shake me. A text from Dad, "Your mother's birthday is next week. She'd love to hear from you." An email from Emily, "The kids are asking about their Aunt Sarah. When can we see you?" A voicemail from Mom, her voice tired and strained. "Sarah, please call us. We miss you." I felt tears prick at my eyes as I set the phone down. This was the price of my newfound independence, the constant, gnawing guilt of knowing I'd upended not just my life, but the lives of those I loved most. But then my gaze fell on the small pottery vase sitting on my coffee table, one of my first completed projects. It was far from perfect, its shape slightly lopsided, the glaze a bit uneven. But it was mine, a tangible representation of the new skills I was developing, the new passions I was exploring. Would I have ever discovered this side of myself if I'd continued down the path of least resistance, forever trying to meet my family's expectations? I stood up, restless energy propelling me across the room. My reflection caught my eye as I passed the mirror hanging in the entryway. I paused, really looking at myself. The woman staring back at me looked different from the Sarah of a few months ago. There was a confidence in her stance, a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there before. But there was also a weariness, a heaviness that spoke of the toll this journey was taking. I turned away from the mirror, my gaze landing on the whiteboard that dominated one wall of my living room. It was covered in ideas for my business, travel plans, books I wanted to read, all the dreams and aspirations I'd been too afraid to voice before. This was the life I was building for myself, step by painstaking step. But was it worth the cost? The question echoed in my mind as I made my way to the kitchen, mechanically going through the motions of making a cup of tea. As the kettle boiled, I found myself thinking about the last conversation I'd had with my therapist, Dr. Larson. Guilt is a complex emotion, Sarah, she'd said, her Swedish accent softening the words. It's not inherently bad. It can be a sign that we care, that we're considerate of others. But when it becomes all-consuming, when it prevents us from living authentically, that's when it becomes problematic. I poured the hot water over the tea bag, watching as the color slowly seeped out, staining the water a deep amber. Dr. Larson's words had struck a chord with me. Yes, I felt guilty about the pain I'd caused my family. But wasn't that guilt also a sign of my love for them? And didn't I owe it to myself, and to them, to be the most authentic version of myself I could be? As I sipped my tea, I pulled out my journal, another new habit I'd picked up in my journey of self-discovery. I began to write, letting my thoughts flow freely onto the page. I am more than the daughter who disappointed her parents, I wrote. I am more than the sister living in Emily's shadow. I am Sarah, entrepreneur, traveler, artist in training. I am imperfect and still learning, but I am whole. The act of putting these words on paper felt cathartic, like I was speaking my truth into existence. But even as I wrote, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered, "But is it enough?" I set my pen down, leaning back in my chair with a sigh. This internal battle was exhausting, a constant tug-of-war between the person I was becoming and the daughter my parents wanted me to be. Some days, I felt like I was winning, striding confidently towards my new life. Other days, like today, the weight of expectation and guilt threatened to drag me under. My phone buzzed, startling me out of my reverie. It was a notification from my calendar, Coffee with Zoe, it read. I felt a small smile tug at my lips. Zoe, a fellow entrepreneur I'd met at a networking event, had quickly become a close friend and confidant. She'd been a steadfast support through this tumultuous time, offering a perspective unclouded by years of family history. I shot her a quick text, "Still on for tomorrow? Could use a friendly ear." Her reply came almost instantly, "Absolutely. Thinking cup at 10? First round's on me." As I set my phone down, I felt some of the tension ease from my shoulders. Tomorrow was another day, another chance to work through this internal struggle. And I didn't have to do it alone. I turned back to my journal, flipping to a new page. At the top, I wrote in bold letters, reasons I made the right choice. Then I began to list, forcing myself to focus on the positives, the growth, the opportunities that had come from my decision. 1. Started my own business. 2. Traveled. 2. Japan. 3. Discovered a passion for pottery. 4. Made new friends who support my journey. 5. Learning to set healthy boundaries. 6. Exploring my own interests and passions. 7. Becoming financially independent. 8. Growing more confident in my decisions. 9. Learning to prioritize my own well-being. 10. Inspiring Emily to make changes in her own life. As the list grew, I felt a sense of calm start to settle over me. Yes, the path I'd chosen was difficult. Yes, there were days when the guilt and doubt felt overwhelming. But looking at this list, I couldn't deny the positive changes in my life. I closed the journal, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. This battle within myself wasn't over, I knew that. There would be more days like this, more moments of doubt and guilt. But there would also be moments of joy, of pride, of self-discovery. And slowly but surely, I was learning that those moments made the struggle worthwhile. As I got ready for bed that night, I paused by the window one last time. The snow was still falling, blanketing the city in white. But now, instead of seeing it as a barrier, I saw it as a clean slate, a fresh start, full of possibility. I thought about my coffee date with Zoe tomorrow, about the client meeting I had later in the week, about the pottery class I was looking forward to on Saturday. I thought about the woman I was becoming, stronger, more confident, more true to herself. And for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to feel proud. Proud of the hard choices I'd made, proud of the boundaries I'd set, proud of the life I was building for myself. As I drifted off to sleep, I made a silent promise to myself. I would continue to work on my relationship with my family, to find a way to bridge the gap between who they wanted me to be and who I was becoming. but I would do it on my terms, as the authentic Sarah I was growing into. The battle within was far from over. But tonight, in this moment, I felt at peace with my choices. And that, I realized, was a victory in itself. The next morning dawned bright and cold, the sun glinting off the fresh snow. As I made my way to the Thinking Cup to meet Zoe, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The doubts and guilt hadn't disappeared entirely. I knew they would be constant companions on this journey. But they no longer felt all-consuming. Zoe was already there when I arrived, 2 steaming cups of coffee on the table in front of her. Her bright smile was a welcome sight after the emotional turmoil of the previous night. "Rough day yesterday?" she asked as I slid into the seat across from her. I nodded, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. Just wrestling with some doubts, wondering if I made the right choice. Zoe's expression softened with understanding. "That's normal, you know. Big changes like this, they don't come without some second-guessing." As I sipped my coffee, I found myself opening up to Zoe about the internal struggle I'd been facing. The guilt over hurting my family, the fear that I was being selfish, the constant battle between the person I was becoming and the daughter my parents wanted me to be. Zoe listened attentively, nodding in understanding. When I finished, she leaned forward, her gaze intense. "Sarah, let me ask you something. If you could go back, knowing what you know now, would you make the same choice?" I paused, really considering the question. The memory of that family dinner flashed through my mind. The accusations, the hurt, the years of feeling inadequate. Then I thought about the months since, the challenges, yes, but also the growth, the discoveries, the sense of finally becoming my true self. "Yes," I said finally, surprising myself with the firmness of my voice. "Yes, I would." Zoe smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "Then you have your answer. It might not be easy, but it's right for you. And that's what matters." As we continued to talk, the weight that had been pressing on my chest began to lift. Zoe shared stories of her own family struggles, of the difficult choices she'd had to make in her journey as an entrepreneur. Her experiences, while different from mine, resonated deeply. "You know," Zoe said as we were finishing our coffee, "someone once told me that guilt is just the growing pains of the soul. It means you're evolving, becoming more than you were before. It's uncomfortable, sure, but it's also a sign of progress." Her words struck a chord with me. I'd been seeing my guilt as a sign that I'd done something wrong. But what if it was actually a sign that I was doing something right? That I was growing, evolving, becoming more authentically myself? As I left the coffee shop, I felt a shift in my perspective. The battle within wasn't something to be won or lost. It was part of the process, a necessary step in my journey of self-discovery and growth. I pulled out my phone, scrolling to my mom's number. My finger hovered over the call button for a moment before I pressed it. It rang several times before she answered, her voice cautious. "Sarah." "Hi, Mom," I said, my voice steady. "I was thinking, maybe we could have lunch next week? Just the two of us." There was a pause, and for a moment I feared she might refuse. But then I heard it, a small catch in her breath, a hint of hope in her voice. "I'd like that, Sarah. I'd like that very much." As I ended the call, I felt a mix of anxiety and anticipation. This lunch wouldn't solve everything. There were still difficult conversations to be had, boundaries to be reestablished. But it was a start. A step towards finding a way to be true to myself while still maintaining a relationship with my family. The battle within was far from over. But as I walked home through the snow-covered streets of Boston, I felt more equipped to face it. I was Sarah, daughter, sister, entrepreneur, artist in training. Imperfect, still learning, but whole. And I was ready to embrace all parts of myself, guilt, doubts, and all. The journey ahead would not be easy. There would be more moments of doubt, more internal struggles. But there would also be moments of joy, of discovery, of pride in how far I'd come. And as I looked towards the future, I felt, for the first time in a long while, truly excited about what it might hold. The battle within had changed. It was no longer about winning or losing, about right or wrong. It was about growth, about becoming. And in that realization, I found a kind of peace I'd never known before. As winter slowly gave way to spring in Boston, I found myself standing at the edge of a new chapter in my life. The city was coming alive again, trees in the public garden budding with fresh green leaves and the first brave crocuses pushing through the soil. It felt like a metaphor for my own journey, a slow, sometimes painful emergence from a long period of dormancy. The lunch I'd had with my mother a few months ago had been the first tentative step towards rebuilding our relationship. It hadn't been easy. There were awkward silences, moments of tension when old habits threatened to resurface. But there had also been glimmers of understanding, tiny shoots of a new kind of connection beginning to take root. As I walked through the common one sunny afternoon, I reflected on the ripple effects my decision had caused. It wasn't just my immediate family that had been affected. The consequences of my choice had spread far wider than I'd initially anticipated. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out to see a message from my cousin Rachel. "Hey Sarah, are you free for a call this evening? Need some advice." I smiled, remembering the last time I'd spoken with Rachel. She'd been hesitant at first, clearly having heard about the family drama from my parents. But as we talked, she'd opened up about her own struggles with family expectations. My story had resonated with her, and she'd started to question some of the choices she'd been making in her own life. As I typed back a quick, "Sure, 7 p.m. work for you," I marveled at how my actions had inadvertently inspired others to examine their own lives. It was a stark reminder that our choices don't just affect us, they can have far-reaching consequences we never anticipated. I continued my walk, letting the warm spring sun soak into my skin. As I passed by the frog pond, I spotted a familiar face, my old college roommate, Jen. She waved enthusiastically, jogging over to meet me. "Sarah, I haven't seen you in ages," she exclaimed, pulling me into a quick hug. "How have you been?" I hesitated for a moment, unsure how much she knew about recent events. "I've been going through some changes," I said finally. "It's been challenging, but good." Jen's expression softened with understanding. "I heard about what happened with your family," she said gently. "That must have been really tough." I nodded, feeling a familiar pang in my chest. It still is sometimes. But I'm learning to stand on my own 2 feet. We started walking together, falling into the easy rhythm we'd had back in our college days. As we talked, I found myself opening up to Jen about everything that had happened. The confrontation with my family, the decision to stop the payments, the struggle to redefine myself. "Wow," Jen said when I finished. That's really brave, Sarah. I don't know if I could have done that." Her words caught me off guard. Brave? I'd never really thought of my actions in those terms. I'd been so focused on the guilt, the fear, the constant second-guessing, that I hadn't considered how my choices might look from the outside. "I don't know about brave," I said, shaking my head. "Most of the time, I feel like I'm just stumbling through, trying to figure things out as I go." Jen stopped walking, turning to face me. "But that's exactly what makes it brave," she insisted. "You're facing your fears, challenging the status quo. Do you have any idea how inspiring that is?" I felt a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. It was one thing to hear encouragement from Zoe, who had only known me post-decision. But to hear it from someone who had known me before, who had seen the person I used to be, that felt different somehow. More validating. As we parted ways, promising to meet up again soon, I found myself reflecting on Jen's words. Had my actions really been inspiring to others? The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. That evening, as I settled in for my call with Rachel, I felt a new sense of purpose. If my journey could help others find the courage to live more authentically, then maybe all the pain and struggle had been worth it. "Sarah," Rachel's voice came through the speaker, sounding nervous. "Thanks for agreeing to talk." "Of course," I replied, making myself comfortable on the couch. "What's on your mind?" There was a pause, and I could almost hear Rachel gathering her courage. "I've been thinking a lot about what you did," she said finally. "Standing up to the family, choosing your own path. And it's made me realize I'm not happy with the direction my life is going." As Rachel poured out her heart, Her doubts about her career choice, her struggle with her parents' expectations, her fear of disappointing everyone. I listened with a growing sense of déjà vu. How many times had I had these same thoughts, these same fears? I just don't know what to do, Rachel finished, her voice thick with emotion. How did you find the courage to make such a big change? I took a deep breath, considering my words carefully. I don't know if it was courage so much as desperation, I said honestly. I reached a point where the pain of staying the same was greater than the fear of change. We talked for over an hour, diving deep into the complexities of family dynamics, self-discovery, and the scary but exhilarating process of charting your own course. As we spoke, I realized how much I had learned, how far I had come. The insights I was sharing with Rachel weren't just platitudes, they were hard-won wisdom from my own journey. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my apartment, feeling a mix of emotions. There was a sense of responsibility, knowing that my actions were influencing others. But there was also a feeling of validation, of purpose. Maybe this was part of why I had needed to go through all of this, not just for myself, but for others who were struggling with similar issues. The next few weeks brought more surprises. Emily called, wanting to meet up for coffee. As we sat in our favorite cafe, the awkwardness of the past few months slowly melting away, she dropped a bombshell. I've decided to go back to school, she said, a mixture of excitement and nervousness in her voice. To finish my master's degree. I nearly choked on my latte. Wow, that's fantastic. But what about? I trailed off, not wanting to bring up the sore subject of family obligations. Emily's smile was bittersweet. Seeing you stand up for yourself, it made me realize how much I've been letting others dictate my life. It's time I did something for me. As she shared her plans, her eyes shining with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen in years, I felt a swell of pride and love for my sister. We had always been pitted against each other, compared and contrasted. But maybe, just maybe, we could forge a new kind of relationship, one built on mutual support and understanding. The ripple effects continued to spread. At a family gathering, which I attended with no small amount of trepidation, I overheard my Uncle Tom talking to my dad. You know, John, he was saying, I've been thinking about what happened with Sarah. And it's made me realize, maybe I've been too hard on my own kids. Maybe it's time I listen to what they want, instead of always telling them what to do. I quickly moved away, not wanting to eavesdrop, but the conversation stayed with me. It was a stark reminder that our actions have the power to influence others in ways we might never expect. But not all the ripple effects were positive. Some family members remained distant, clearly disapproving of my choices. There were still awkward silences at gatherings, pointed comments about family loyalty and obligation. And I knew that for my parents, the adjustment was ongoing and often painful. One evening, as I was leaving my pottery class, which had become a cherished part of my weekly routine, I ran into my mother. She was standing outside the community center, looking uncertain. "Mom?" I said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" She looked almost embarrassed. I wanted to see," she said hesitantly. "This thing that's become so important to you." We ended up going for a walk, the spring evening mild and fragrant with blooming flowers. As we talked, really talked, for what felt like the first time in years, I began to see the ripple effects from her perspective. "It hasn't been easy," she admitted, her voice soft. "Seeing you pull away, watching you build a life that's so different from what we imagined for you. But I'm starting to understand. And I'm proud of you, Sarah. It takes courage to be true to yourself." Her words, so similar to what Jen had said, brought tears to my eyes. We still had a long way to go, but this felt like a breakthrough. As spring turned to summer, I found myself reflecting on the past year. The decision I'd made, which had seemed so personal at the time, had set off a chain reaction that I never could have predicted. It had challenged family dynamics, inspired others to make changes in their own lives, and forced all of us to re-examine our assumptions and expectations. There had been pain, yes. Misunderstandings, hurt feelings, damaged relationships. But there had also been growth, newfound understanding, and the slow, careful construction of healthier boundaries and more authentic connections. Sitting on my small balcony one warm evening, watching the sun set over the Boston skyline, I thought about the metaphor of ripples in a pond. One small action, spreading outward in ever-widening circles, affecting everything it touches. My decision had been the stone dropped into the pond of my family's life, and we were all still feeling the effects. But ripples eventually fade, I reminded myself. The water returns to calm, forever changed by the disturbance, but calm nonetheless. As I sipped my tea and watched the sky turn from gold to pink to deep blue, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The ripples of my decision were still spreading, still affecting my life and the lives of those around me. But I was no longer afraid of the waves. I was learning to ride them, to navigate this new reality I had created. My phone buzzed with a text from Zoe. "Drinks tomorrow to celebrate your new client? First round's on me." I smiled, typing back a quick, "You're on." Before putting my phone away, I scrolled through my recent messages. Rachel asking for advice on grad school applications, Emily sharing a funny story about her kids, Mom asking if I was free for lunch next week. Each message a ripple, a connection, a reminder of how far we'd all come. The journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges ahead, more ripple effects to navigate. But as I sat there, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky, I felt ready to face whatever came next. I had found my strength, my voice, my authentic self. And that, I realized, was the most powerful ripple effect of all. The Boston summer was in full swing, the city alive with energy and possibility. As I walked through the bustling streets of the North End, the scent of fresh bread and espresso wafting from the Italian bakeries, I couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in the past year. It was hard to believe that just 12 months ago, I had been trapped in a cycle of guilt and obligation, desperately trying to meet everyone's expectations but my own. Now, as I made my way to meet Zoe for our weekly coffee catch-up, I felt a sense of lightness and purpose that had once seemed impossibly out of reach. Zoe was already at our usual table at Thinking Cup when I arrived, 2 steaming lattes waiting. Her face lit up as I approached, and I was struck once again by how grateful I was for her friendship. "So," she said as I sat down, her eyes twinkling with excitement, "are you ready for the big day tomorrow?" I took a deep breath, a mix of nerves and anticipation fluttering in my stomach. As ready as I'll ever be, I guess. Tomorrow was the official launch of my new business venture, a consultancy firm focused on helping small businesses and startups navigate the complex world of finance and strategy. It was the culmination of months of hard work, sleepless nights, and more than a few moments of self-doubt. But it was also the physical manifestation of my journey towards authenticity and self-realization. "You're going to be amazing," Zoe assured me, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "You've come so far, Sarah. You should be proud of yourself." As we chatted about last-minute preparations and first-day jitters, my mind wandered back to the path that had led me here. The confrontation with my family, the difficult decision to stop the monthly payments, the internal battles, the ripple effects, each challenge had been a stepping stone, leading me to this moment. After finishing our coffee, Zoe and I parted ways with a hug and a promise to celebrate properly after the launch. As I walked home, I decided to take a detour through the public garden. The park was alive with activity, children laughing as they rode the swan boats, couples strolling hand in hand, street performers entertaining crowds with music and magic tricks. I found a quiet bench near the lake and sat down, taking a moment to soak in the beauty of the day. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out to see a message from Emily. "Just wanted to wish you good luck for tomorrow. We're all rooting for you, sis. Love you." A warm feeling spread through my chest. My relationship with Emily had undergone a profound transformation over the past year. Where once there had been competition and resentment, now there was support and understanding. We had both grown, both learned to break free from the roles we'd been assigned and to forge our own paths. As if on cue, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from my mother. "Sarah, darling, your father and I just wanted to let you know how proud we are of you. We may not always understand your choices, but we see how happy and fulfilled you are. That's all we ever wanted for you. Good luck tomorrow. We love you." Tears pricked at my eyes as I read and reread the message. It hadn't been an easy journey with my parents. There had been heated arguments, painful silences, and moments when I feared our relationship was irreparably damaged. But slowly, painstakingly, we had begun to rebuild. To see each other not as parent and child, or as providers and dependent, but as individuals with our own dreams, fears, and aspirations. As I sat there, the late afternoon sun warming my face, I thought about the concept of new beginnings. So often, we think of them as clean breaks, a clear line dividing the past from the future. But I was learning that new beginnings were more complex than that. They were built on the foundations of our past, shaped by our experiences, our mistakes, our triumphs. My new beginning hadn't started the moment I decided to stop the payments, or when I confronted my family, or even when I first conceived of my business idea. It had been a gradual process, a series of small choices and realizations that had led me to this point. I stood up, brushing off my jeans and starting the walk back to my apartment. As I moved through the familiar streets, I found myself noticing details I'd never paid attention to before: the intricate brickwork on a historic building, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves of the trees lining Commonwealth Avenue, the smiles exchanged between strangers as they passed on the sidewalk. It struck me that this, too, was part of my new beginning. Learning to be present, to appreciate the beauty in the everyday moments. To see the world not as a series of obligations to be met or expectations to be fulfilled, but as a canvas of possibilities. Back in my apartment, I spent the evening going over my presentation for the launch one last time. As I rehearsed my speech, I was struck by how confident I felt. Not just in my business plan or my market research, but in myself. In my ability to face challenges, to learn from setbacks, to stay true to my values even when it was difficult. Before going to bed, I took a moment to write in my journal, another habit I'd picked up over the past year. As I reflected on the eve of this new chapter in my life, I found myself writing a letter to my past self. Dear Sarah, I wish I could tell you that the road ahead is easy, that there won't be moments of doubt or pain or fear. But that wouldn't be the truth. The truth is, it's going to be hard. There will be days when you question everything, when the weight of expectations and guilt feels crushing. But I want you to know that it's worth it. Every tear, every sleepless night, every difficult conversation, it's all leading you to a place of strength and authenticity that you can't even imagine right now. You're going to learn so much about business, yes, but more importantly, about yourself. You're going to discover passions you never knew you had, strengths you didn't realize you possessed. You're going to build relationships based on mutual respect and understanding, not obligation and resentment. It won't happen overnight. This journey of self-discovery and growth is ongoing. But each step you take, each challenge you face, will bring you closer to becoming the person you're meant to be. So be brave. Be kind to others, but also to yourself. And remember, your worth isn't determined by how much you can give to others or how well you meet their expectations. Your worth is inherent, unchanging, and entirely your own. The road ahead isn't easy, but I promise you, it's beautiful. Embrace it all, the highs and the lows, the victories and the setbacks. They're all part of your story. You've got this, Sarah. I believe in you. As I closed my journal, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new beginnings. But for the first time in my life, I felt truly ready to face them. I woke up the next morning to the soft glow of sunrise peeking through my curtains. For a moment, I lay still, listening to the city coming to life outside my window. Today was the day, the official launch of my business, the tangible start of this new chapter in my life. As I went through my morning routine, I was struck by how calm I felt. There were nerves, certainly. This was a big step, after all. But underlying the butterflies in my stomach was a steady current of confidence and excitement. I put on the outfit I'd carefully chosen the night before, a smart blazer over a blouse in my favorite shade of blue, paired with tailored trousers. Professional, but still uniquely me. As I looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. Not because of the clothes or the carefully applied makeup, but because of the quiet strength and self-assurance in her eyes. My phone buzzed with a flurry of good luck messages from Zoe, from Emily, from college friends who'd heard about the launch. Each one brought a smile to my face, a reminder of the support network I'd built and nurtured over the past year. As I was about to leave, there was a knock at my door. Puzzled, I wasn't expecting anyone this early. I opened it to find my parents standing there, looking slightly nervous but smiling. "Mom? Dad? What are you doing here?" I asked, surprised but touched by their presence. My father cleared his throat, looking uncharacteristically emotional. We wanted to wish you luck in person, and to tell you how proud we are of you, Sarah." My mother nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "We know we haven't always understood your choices, but seeing you now, so confident and happy, we just want you to know that we support you, wholly and completely." I felt my own eyes well up as I pulled them both into a hug. This, I realized, was the true meaning of family, not obligation or expectation, but unconditional love and support, even when the path isn't what you expected. After they left, promising to take me out for a celebration dinner that evening, I made my way to the venue where the launch was being held. As I walked through the streets of Boston, the city I'd called home my entire life, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. For the challenges that had shaped me, for the people who had supported me, for the strength I'd found within myself. The launch event was a whirlwind of presentations, networking, and fielding questions from potential clients and partners. As I stood at the podium, presenting my vision for the future of my company, I felt a surge of pride and accomplishment. This was more than just a business venture. It was a declaration of who I was and what I stood for. As the event wound down and the last of the attendees filtered out, I found myself alone in the now quiet conference room. I took a moment to sit down, to breathe, to let the reality of what I'd just accomplished sink in. My phone buzzed with a message from Zoe. "You are amazing. Can't wait to celebrate with you later. So proud of you, Sarah." I smiled, feeling a wave of emotion wash over me. A year ago, I never could have imagined being here, doing this. I had been so caught up in trying to be what everyone else wanted me to be that I'd lost sight of who I truly was. But now, as I sat in the aftermath of my business launch, I realized that I had finally found myself. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been tears and doubts, difficult conversations, and painful realizations. But each challenge had been a step towards this moment, towards becoming the authentic, confident woman I was today. As I gathered my things and prepared to leave, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. The woman looking back at me was smiling, her eyes bright with the promise of the future. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, an entrepreneur. She was imperfect and still learning, but she was whole. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and stepped out into the Boston afternoon. The city stretched out before me, familiar yet somehow new, filled with possibilities I was finally ready to explore. This was more than just a new beginning. It was a continuation, an evolution, a step further along the path of becoming. And as I walked down the sun-drenched street, ready to celebrate with the people I loved, I felt a profound sense of excitement for whatever came next. Because whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever new beginnings awaited, I knew one thing for certain. I was ready to face them as my true, authentic self. And that, I realized, was the greatest accomplishment of all.